Right, these lectures are numbered, but I never know if it's going to take more than one session or less than one session to get through them. So that's why I have planned to go to lecture 10 tonight if we get there, but who knows if we will or not. But what we're going to talk about tonight, and I think for those of you who are in the United States, this will be directly of interest. For those of you not in the United States, hopefully it'll provide some new insight about who owns the land across the United States, a little bit about how public policy contributes to a vast underutilization of our land, and how this causes recurring instability and the cyclical downturns that often end in prolonged recessions or depressions. We might remember one astute analyst observed, and I don't remember who it's attributed to, but that this person said, when my neighbor is unemployed, we are in a recession. When I'm unemployed, we are in a depression. And so, it does really, an individual's position in society and how well one is protected from downturns has a lot to do with our perceptions of what's going on around us and in the world. Well, economists, they really need to revisit, I think, the theoretical contributions and the historical evidence that's presented in Henry George's works. Certainly, that was my introduction to Henry George, and he got me thinking a lot differently about how our markets work than I had previously, been introduced to through standard economics courses and even history courses. And what's most important to me about George's analysis with regard to land markets is how this associates with economic cycles. On this subject, George points to land monopoly as the primary destabilizing force. And he says this about that connection. He writes, as population grows and technology advances, land values rise. This steady increase leads to speculation as future increases are anticipated. He goes on and says, land values are carried beyond the point at which labor and capital receive their customary returns. Production, therefore, begins to stop. It seems so simple and straightforward, and yet when you think about it, this is exactly what occurs. That at some point, people can no longer absorb the rising costs of acquiring land or leasing land and how that translates into leasing office space or warehouse space. And so we begin to see a contraction in economic activity, and eventually production, as he says, begins to stop. And to add some credibility to Henry George's analysis, here's the advice that was given to us by someone who knows how things work, and that's J. Paul Getty. And J. Paul Getty, as you probably know, made his fortune in fossil fuels. And he said at one point, if you want to get rich, buy land. Not just any land will do, of course. Beginning in 1949, Getty paid Ibn Saud $9.5 million in cash and $1 million a year for a 60-year concession to attractive land near the border of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. From 1953 onward, his gamble produced 16 million barrels of oil a year, and it made him one of the richest people in the world. In essence, what Getty paid to the Saudis was far below the full annual rental value of the oil-rich lands he controlled. And so he made a fortune on the difference between the rents that were collected by the Saudi princes and the rents that were the true value of the land itself. So in Henry George's mind, as he would have looked at this, it raises an important ethical question, and that is to whom the oil beneath the surface belongs. Did it belong to the Saudi princes, to the Saudi people as a whole, or people of the globe as a whole? I mean, this is a real difficult issue for us in a world that's divided up into nation states and where we claim sovereign control over the land and natural resources within the borders of our claimed sovereign states. At this point, our world system pretty much leaves only the open seas as a potential source for rents to be captured and shared globally. And some of you may know that there was thinking behind this issue when the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was adopted in 1982. It had been under discussion for about a decade. The United States of America objected to provisions relating to deep seabed mining. And so although the convention was modified in 1994, the last time the US government held hearings to further discuss joining the convention was back in 2012. I haven't seen lately whether it's back on the agenda at all, but our mining companies that mine the seabeds obviously use their lobbying influence to prevent the United States from agreeing that some sharing of rents would go into a global fund out of their activities, which seems like an issue that needs to be really brought up to a higher level of discourse in the international community if we're ever going to get this issue resolved fairly for the people of the globe. Governments of oil exporting nations realized that their long-term interests rest on raising the price of oil extracted by limiting the supply. That is, by keeping some oil-rich lands idle or reducing production. And of course, this is not a unique practice. Rather, those who have control over land in all its forms know that holding some land idle will raise the value of other lands with a similar potential use. I have a personal story to tell you on this. Back when I was in graduate school, this is somewhere around 1986 or 7. I can't remember the exact year. I had a course on national public policy analysis, and we were asked to choose a project that would involve doing a significant amount of statistical analysis using some, basic calculus. And I chose as my subject, what is the optimum price of a barrel of oil for the Saudis? And on the surface, one would think, well, it's the highest that the market would bear. But the Saudis had already began to do a great deal of diversification in their investment activity. Even domestically, they were trying to move their economy away from being solely dependent on oil production. And of course, I'm sure many of you know how many hotels and resorts and office buildings and agricultural land that they have acquired all around the world with the revenue that they've gained from selling the oil. So I did as much research as I could based on the statistics available, and they weren't easy to find. Believe me, the Saudis did not make it easy to get a good hold on what their economy was doing. But I managed to get enough information together, ran it through this calculus analysis, and I came up with an answer that the optimum price of a barrel of oil for the Saudis was $29 a barrel. If I had believed in my analysis and invested all the money that I had at the time in the futures market for oil, I would have made a fortune, because less than a year later, that's what the spot price of a barrel of oil hit. But it was an intellectual project that went over well with my professor, but it didn't help me at all in my personal financial situation. I don't know, maybe some of you have gone through a similar type of experience where you've come up with something really great in terms of your analysis, and you just were not confident enough in it to rely on it to make other decisions. But I have that paper on my website. If anyone's interested, you can find it there. Well, Henry George thought very deeply about all this and about these connections, and he studied history. He observed the contemporary experience. And in the end of all of his research and work, here's what he concluded. He says, the only thing that can explain why people are forced to stand idle when they would willingly work to supply their wants is that labor is denied access to land. It is not that all land is in use. What prevents labor from using this land? Simply that land has been monopolized. It is held at speculative prices based not on present value, but on value that will come with future population growth. And it's a really critical observation when you think about it. Those who have acquired land, even if it's improved, even if it has a building on it, a warehouse or whatever, the thinking not just about today, but about the future, knowing how land markets work, knowing that, as people are moving into an area, that the value of that land will go up. In fact, it may have an eventual changing use. Think about, for example, around every major city, whether it's in the United States or most other countries, unless there are very, very tight urban growth boundaries established. The land around the cities is usually first agricultural, or simply vacant, not used. It's open space. Then societies spend the money to begin building roadways or railroads. Everywhere there is an interchange on an interstate highway, commerce begins to develop. Land values will increase. All it takes is a service station, then a motel, maybe a truck stop, and then begins to have other businesses congregate there. When the railroads went across the United States in the 1800s, the railroads dictated where stops would be, and wherever they chose to make those stops, of course, they held a good deal of the land surrounding those stops and were able to, financially benefit very well by the fact that they were establishing a stop on that railroad, and people gravitated to where that stop was. Farmers would bring their agricultural crops into that location. All sorts of services had to be created, and land values increased. So it's just logic, it's common sense that exactly what Henry George observes here happens. You can make mistakes. There are plenty of cases around the world. In fact, there's a television program that I watch every once in a while on one of the channels about all the vacated properties that exist. Just massive construction of infrastructure, and all of a sudden abandoned for any numbers of reasons. And they investigate those stories. I don't know if any of you have seen those stories on television, but some of them are really fascinating to see how so much money was invested in the development of the infrastructure of buildings, et cetera. And then for some reason or some set of reasons, all of a sudden people leave and it's left to decay and maybe find an alternative use eventually. But so there's no absolute guarantee that over the long run, holding land will guarantee an increase in value, but certainly wherever there is a continuing arrival of population and population growth, that is the strong tendency. And I use that word tendency importantly because Henry George's laws of production and distribution are laws of tendency. He's saying that there are externalities that will affect the direction and the speed with which all of this happens. But if you look closely enough, long enough, you'll see this tendency occurring and how it plays out in the real world over time. And remember, this is a basic course. This was designed to present to people who've never taken a course in political economy at the Henry George School, or even never taken an economics course, to think just about some fundamental basic relationships and how they affect outcomes in our daily lives. And so getting back to this fundamental analysis, I'm asking you to remember that much of the land of the European continent remained unoccupied and undeveloped, even as people of Europe found it necessary to board ships for other continents in search of a better life. I mean, their reason for leaving was sometimes religious oppression, cultural oppression, outright poverty, whatever it might be. People left places that still had plenty of opportunity for them to use their labor if they could get access to land and produce wealth for their own use and the use of their family. Now, several hundred years was then required before the European conquest of the Americas was finished, before the displacement of the continent's earlier peoples was achieved. And none of that was peaceful. None of that was very systematic. But over time, we see that people who were less well developed in terms of their ability to engage in warfare and their ability to extract wealth from the earth were displaced by those who had already achieved a superior level of those capabilities. Once the conquest by the European peoples secured the Atlantic coastal regions of North America, frontiersmen went into the still uninhabited area by Europeans. They were then followed by settlers and by land speculators into the interior. And many of them, not just the speculators, but the settlers, hoped to amass huge landed estates or acquire and hold land in anticipation of further population increases and the establishment of towns, roadways, and markets. And then when the canal system began, that opened up, trade between the coasts and the interior even more so. The Ohio Company was one of the early companies formed with many of the founding generation members as principal shareholders. George Washington was one of the principals. And this is just one example of how European Americans moved to subdue the continent. So as the 19th century advanced, take a look at this map, and there's just an advertisement of, if you want to own a farm or home, contact the railroad, because the railroad has access to these lands, and they'll do exactly what I mentioned earlier. They will establish, small towns, etc., will grow up around every stop in the railroad where cattle can be brought in, where agricultural commodities can be brought in, where mining occurs and raw materials can be brought to a central place for refining, processing, and then eventually turned into manufactured goods. So as the 19th century advanced, a really financially weak government of the United States had only one option in order to pay its bills other than imposing tariffs on goods. And that was to dispose of the public domain to speculators and to some homesteaders, and most importantly, to the railroad companies, as part of the bargain to achieve rapid population and settlement across the continent. And that certainly was a political objective, getting people across the continent, settling across the continent, turning virgin lands and frontiers into territories then to states, and then solidifying the whole into a very significant new nation state that could compete with the European powers. Now, despite all of the huge land grants and the sales, this is what the country basically looks like today in terms of the federal government owning about 29% of the nation's land area. And as you can see from the red, most of the land that is held in the western states and Alaska. It's created a good deal of political animosity towards the federal government in those states where the red marks are the largest. State and local governments control another 9%, Trust lands held by the tribes of First Americans account for about 2%, and this leaves 60% of the land area, about 1.4 billion acres, in private hands. But is it important? And Henry George would remind us, this is simply land area and not land value. So one of the things we from a standpoint of analyzing where economic activity is greatest is to look at, where land values are great. So here's just a map of the United States, a couple of years old now, that shows the private lands, the percentage of private lands. So you can see Nevada has almost none. Somewhere it's like 12%. And then the states with bright red are the states where there is the least government held land. And so, Walter, this is a map that probably would help you make your case or an analysis of which of these state economies is potentially the strongest based on the percentage of land that's held privately versus publicly. I don't know if that would help you make your case or not, but it's certainly worth looking at if you're an economist, if you're trying to come up with public policies regarding land use. Where do we get the best bang for our buck in terms of our use of public resources? Is it where states have the greatest amount of privately held land or less so? Worth looking at, but not by me right now. Over the last 200 years, much of the land area held by the nation's wealthiest families has, of course, changed hands. There was a paper I read some years ago about what happened to some of the wealthiest individuals in the 1920s by the middle of the Great Depression. And it was interesting to see how many of those individuals had really lost most of their nominal wealth during the Depression. I was kind of surprised. I can't remember the author who did the research, but it was a significant number of pretty wealthy people who ended up in the middle of the Depression. I guess they over invested in the shares and stock market and lost their shirts. Maybe, as Frederick Lewis Allen talked about, there were many people who speculated in land in Florida who lost a lot when the hurricanes hit in the 20s. All across the nation, all of that was very dynamic during the 20s. A lot of speculation, a lot of small banks went under, became insolvent because of the speculation value loans they made for people who were increasing their acreage in agriculture and who borrowed from those local banks in order to speculate in land in the cities. So it's not a guaranteed thing that the framers, if George Washington's descendants, I don't know where they are or what they held, but he was the largest landowner in the country at the time of his death. But certainly his estate was divided up, and who owns those lands now, I don't know if any of his descendants still are major landholders across the country. But even so, the ownership of land in the country is highly concentrated, and it's becoming more so each year. Today, just 50 individuals and families own around 31 million acres of land scattered across the United States. And I'll give you a couple of the major landowners and where they got their wealth from. Here's John Malone. He served as an executive in the telecommunications industry. He holds about 2.2 million acres of land. Back in 2011, he purchased 1 million acres more of woods in Maine and New Hampshire for I guess, use of add to the lumber industry. I don't know what he's doing with the land. He acquired a 290,000 acre ranch in New Mexico the previous year. And I haven't looked lately, but I suspect he's probably still moving ahead with more acquisitions. Ted Turner, founder of Turner Broadcasting. He has, at last count, about 2 million acres in 12 states. And he also owns a considerable amount of land outside of the United States, although I could not get any statistics on his non-US holdings. Red Emerson, who's the president of Sierra Pacific Industries. This is a family-run lumber manufacturing business that ranks as California's largest private landowner. He has about 2 million acres of forest land in California and Washington State. And then there's this fellow whose investment in agricultural land has caused some controversy, Bill Gates. Gates owns about 242,000 acres of agricultural land across 18 states. He has another 26,000 acres of land, including a large tract outside of Phoenix, Arizona, that he says is going to be used to develop a state-of-the-planet smart city. Maybe someone has some information on where that project is these days. I haven't found anything recently on it. I have this photograph of an urban center, a city, because I mean the land holdings of Gates and these other folks, they're largely in rural areas, natural resource areas. But when you think about it, of course, the most valuable land is in our cities and towns. When I say valuable, I'm talking about the monetary price of the land. It's where land is valued not by the acre, but by the square foot. And so, that brings up the question, okay, who owns our cities? And I've tried to get as much information as I can, but I can tell you there's no central database to tell you who owns the urban land in our cities. The best that I could come up with is looking at commercial real estate, and that is developed, commercial real estate is land developed commercially. There are 25 real estate companies that own about 4 billion square feet of commercial real estate in the United States and overseas. And so those 25 companies own buildings that would occupy the city of Boston entirely. If all of them, they would own every building in the city of Boston. That's the area square footage of their actual building. How much those companies have land banked, how much they have put options to purchase land in and around the cities, I haven't been able to find any data on. A lot of this stuff is proprietary. If you're willing to pay for it, there are companies that have the data, and if you're doing market analysis to determine where you want to put a new location, and you're willing to pay for it, you can usually find out a good deal of information. There are about 3 million owners of farmland in the United States. Only half of them actually farm the land they hold. About 44% of owners are what we would think of as rentiers. They lease out the land to actual farmers at market rents. And those who are rentiers are a fairly concentrated small group, with just 8% of that class of owners controlling over half of the acreage owned. So those who are owners of agricultural land who lease it out to farmers own a lot of land. That is their primary activity. It's not a side gig. It is something they do as their primary business activity. Somewhat surprisingly, individuals still own more than 2/3 of all farm acreage. we hear all the time about the family farm, the, you know, going under or disappearing, but 2/3 of all farmers still own their acreage. There are 32,500 non-family held corporations, and they own just 5% of all farmland in the United States. Now, is this stable? Is it a trend that is going to move in one direction or another? Farming is an expensive undertaking. The cost of energy, the cost of fertilizers, the difficulty in getting labor, all of this comes into play. I am really glad that there are people who are willing to take the risk of engaging in producing our agricultural goods. But it's not something that most of us would be prepared to undertake. Although there is some movement back to the land. There are some people who have, particularly once organic farming became as much a social commitment as opposed to simply a way to make a living, that there are more and more people moving back to the land to engage in that kind of agriculture, as opposed to the kind of monoculture that this photograph, suggests exists. So there are a lot of changes going on in agricultural production, some of them for the good, but certainly with climate change, changing weather patterns, changing amount of rainfall, et cetera, it's a highly risky undertaking. And government, whether you think it's a good idea or not, government has intervened in a fairly significant way. We'll talk about that in just a second. If we look at just the privately owned agricultural land in the country, we find that whites account for 96% of the owners. They account for 97% of the value and 98% of the acres. Over time, because of racial bias and et cetera, and difficulty in getting loans from banks, Black owners of farms have lost those farms. There are today now just 45,000 Black owned farms out of 3.4 million farmers in the country. And they own just 2% of the nation's agricultural land. Here's a chart that shows you what the trends have been for agricultural land. So this gives you crop value in US dollars per acre, and you can see how it has increased. Has it increased faster than the general rate of inflation? Below the general rate of inflation? I haven't tried to do any kind of an analysis, but you can see that cropland value has climbed. And so if you are a beginning farmer, if you're the son of an existing farmer and your parents are still alive in farming and you want to go out on your own, it's going to be pretty difficult for you to raise the financial assets to purchase land outright. So you're probably inclined to contact one of the rentier, individuals or companies that are offering land for lease. So the average increase between 2021 and 2022 in cropland prices was 14%. And the average price rose to a little over $5,000 per acre. When you're paying that much for land and commodity prices fall at all, if your projections of the revenue you need to pay off your agricultural loans or just service those loans, if your revenue declines, you have serious problems. So government has stepped in to say we need to protect our farmers, put farmers in quote, because There's a lot of discussion about who is actually being protected here, and who should be protected. But the U.S. taxpayers provide about $6 billion annually in subsidies to pay for premiums under the federal crop insurance program. Does that make sense as public policy? You think about it, we can chat about that in just a minute or two. A more recent, but I think significant factor in the attractiveness of owning land is the potential to lease the land for oil and gas exploration or for solar and wind farms. Solar farms leases are yielding about, and this is a wide range, the numbers I saw, between $300 and $2,000 per acre per year to the landowners. Leases of land for wind turbine farms have an equally wide range of rents. Those are yielding somewhere around between $8,000 per year to as much as $80,000 per year. So it's probably too late to get into this game now. I don't know how much Gates and others and many others. When I was a lender, we often would get people who had what we called hobby farms, lawyers, doctors, who had their primary residence in a city or some suburban community. They would be something like a weekend farmer. They would buy a hobby farm. They actually had it as a second home and maybe have 100 acres around it or something like that. And the question always was, how much should we as a lender on a residential property make a loan for? How do you carve out a residential plot from this hobby farm in order to approve a loan for the people that are buying it? And that's just a practical decision, as a lending institution, about how much risk you're willing to undertake when someone is not, and you're primarily a residential lender, and this is not primarily a residential property. But there are, there are probably hundreds of thousands of hobby farms around the country owned by people who either are not farming them at all, and just holding them as a second home type of property, or they might be leasing out some of the land to an actual farmer. All sorts of mechanisms that people come up with on how to use land, how to own it, expand their ownership for whatever reasons. And at the bottom, I don't know if they are thinking about profiting on the net imputed rental value of the land being capitalized into a higher and higher selling price. We instinctively, those of us who own a residential property, if we do, whether it's a condo or a single family property, we're trained to think, educated to think that this is an investment. It's shelter, but it's also an investment. That the value, the market price that asset will yield over time will increase. That's the general expectation. We don't think at all about the fact that our housing unit is a depreciating asset. I've said this before, that every year it costs us a significant amount of money for maintenance, and every decade or so it costs us a huge amount of money for systems replacement. And so, the asset that we call a house is a depreciating asset that mortgage lenders understood years ago. We only make a maximum loan up to 30 years because we anticipate that the housing unit itself will depreciate down to scrap value at the end of that 30-year period. Of course, that's not usually going to happen, but it does happen. And so you don't want to have a loan balance on your books toward the end of that mortgage loan that is greater than the depreciated value of the property. But fortunately, in most cases, land values will compensate for the depreciation in the price of the housing. And when you get into discussions with people about the virtues of land value taxation, if you do, I urge you to think about that in your discussion of pointing out to them that, well, your house is a depreciating asset, just like your automobile. I often use the example in conversation. Okay, you went into the Jaguar dealer and you love this Jaguar sports car, and you bought it, you took it out and rode it around the block, and all of a sudden you just didn't like the feel of it or the whatever. So you drove it back to the dealer and you said, I want my money back. I don't like this. I don't really like the car as much as I thought I was going to. And the dealer says, okay, fine, we'll buy it back from you. Okay, it was, let's see, you paid us $90,000 and you drove it for a half an hour, so we can only give you $86,400 back because the car had depreciated. And yet we expect exactly the opposite to occur with housing units. That's just a subject for conversation with friends and family. Okay, so what about land trusts? That's something else that's going on in the world. There are also many efforts to protect land from future development by putting the ownership of land into preservation trusts. There are about 1,900 land trusts in the United States, and they have managed to gain control of about 56 million acres of land. Is that a good thing? Setting aside this land from ever being developed into perpetuity, a matter for discussion. Local, state, and federal laws in the United States also exempt from taxation the value of land and buildings owned by religious organizations, educational institutions, and charities. However, the presence of these institutions in the community has the effect of increasing the value of other land in the same way as do the presence of public improvements and amenities. At least that's the one argument in favor of exempting these types of properties from the real estate tax. Again, another subject for discussion. And so I will stop there. This is the end of this lecture.